Have you ever noticed how much of your energy gets stolen, not by life itself, but by the people who try to provoke you? Think about it. Someone throws an insult, someone mocks you, someone questions your worth, and instantly your heart races, your mind spins, and before you even realize it, you've handed over your peace of mind to a stranger's words. It happens every single day, at work, online, even inside our own families. And the strange thing is, the more we react, the more power we give away. It's like carrying a bucket of water across a long path, but instead of focusing on your destination, you stop at every corner just to argue with someone. By the time you reach the end, the bucket is empty. You've spilled everything that was meant to nourish your journey. The Buddha once compared life's challenges to arrows being shot in our direction. The first arrow, pain, insult, disappointment, often cannot be avoided. But the second arrow, our reaction, our anger, our constant need to defend, is the one we aim at ourselves. That second arrow hurts far more than the first. And here lies the secret. When we refuse to pick up that second arrow, we stop bleeding unnecessarily. Ignoring is not weakness. It is not passivity. It is not running away. It is the art of protecting your inner temple from being vandalized by every random passerby. To ignore wisely is to recognize that not every opinion deserves your attention, not every attack deserves your answer, and not every fight is worth your time. The power of ignoring is the power of choosing. Choosing where your energy flows, choosing which voices matter, choosing which battles actually lead to peace. Imagine how much lighter your days could be if you stopped wrestling with shadows and started walking in your own light. There's a saying in Zen, the loudest noise loses its meaning in the presence of silence. Think of a drum beaten furiously in an empty valley. The sound echoes but eventually fades into nothing. Silence does not fight the noise, it simply outlasts it. In the same way, when you master the ability to remain untouched by other people's negativity, their noise no longer has the power to define you. And maybe that's the lesson modern life keeps forgetting. We live in a world that rewards reaction. Social media thrives on it. News headlines demand it. Even casual conversations often push us to take sides, to argue, to prove, to defend. But while everyone else is exhausting themselves in endless battles, you can choose a different path, the path of stillness, of clarity, of quiet strength. This path doesn't mean shutting yourself off from the world. It means learning the art of discernment. It means asking yourself, does this comment deserve my energy? Does this fight bring me closer to peace or pull me further away? When the answer is no, you simply let go. And that act of letting go is not defeat, it's freedom. So, as we begin this journey, remember this: the world will never stop trying to provoke you. There will always be noise, always be critics, always be voices that try to drag you into their storms. But you don't have to step into every storm. You don't have to drink every poison. You don't have to carry every stone that's thrown your way. True power is not in proving yourself to others, it's in not needing to. True power is in mastering your response, guarding your peace, and walking forward with clarity no matter how loud the world becomes. And once you taste this kind of strength, you realize something life-changing, that ignoring wisely is not about turning away from life. It is about finally stepping into it unshaken, undisturbed, and completely free. We live in a world where almost everything demands a reaction. Scroll through your phone for 5 minutes and you'll notice someone is arguing, someone is offended, someone is shouting their opinion louder than everyone else. And what do? We feel the pull. We want to respond, to correct, to jump in. It feels impossible to stay quiet when the world seems to invite us into every single battle. But here's the truth no one likes to admit. The more we react, the less we live. Think about it. Imagine you're walking down a beautiful path toward your dream. Suddenly, someone on the side of the road throws a rock at you. If you stop every single time to pick up that rock, to throw it back, to argue about why it was thrown, how far will you ever get? By the time you finish, the day is gone, your energy is wasted, and your journey is stalled. This is the trap most people fall into, the trap of constant reactions. We've been conditioned to believe that silence means weakness, that ignoring means we've lost. So we defend ourselves, we explain, we argue, we try to control how others see us. And yet the more we fight, the deeper we sink into the quicksand of endless conflict. The Buddha used to say, just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life. But what is a spiritual life if not the ability to rise above the noise? When we respond to every insult, every criticism, every provocation, we are not rising. We are lowering ourselves to the same ground where anger and ego fight endlessly. Have you noticed how draining it feels after a heated argument? Your body is tense. Your mind replays the conversation. Your peace is gone. Even hours later, you're still stuck in the energy of that moment. This is how reactions enslave us. They don't just end with words, they linger, they haunt. They steal tomorrow's joy by keeping us trapped in yesterday's battles. The greatest tragedy of constant reaction is that it blinds us to what truly matters. Instead of directing our energy toward growth, compassion, or inner peace, we spend it defending ourselves against shadows. We let other people's moods dictate our state of mind. In essence, we hand them the keys to our happiness. And here's the most dangerous part. Reaction becomes a habit, just like reaching for your phone without thinking. Reacting to every provocation becomes automatic. Someone criticizes you, you snap back. Someone disrespects you, you argue. Someone spreads lies, you rush to defend. Before long, your entire life feels like one long fight and you don't even know who you are fighting anymore. But what if you could break this cycle? What if you could train your mind to pause, to breathe, to ask, does this deserve my energy? Does this bring me closer to peace? That simple pause is revolutionary. It interrupts the chain reaction. It stops the fire from spreading. It gives you back control. Life will never stop throwing rocks. People will never stop provoking. But you are not obligated to stop at every stone. You are not required to attend every argument you're invited to. Freedom begins the moment you realize you don't have to play every game the world sets up for you. Because the truth is this: reacting may feel satisfying in the moment, but it always comes at a cost. Your peace, your clarity, your time. And once you see that cost clearly, you'll start to realize that not every fight is worth fighting. And that realization opens the door to something far more powerful than reaction: restraint. There's a voice inside all of us that refuses to be ignored. When someone criticizes us, that voice screams, say something, defend yourself, prove them wrong. It feels almost unbearable to stay silent in the face of judgment. That inner voice is the ego, and its greatest obsession is to protect its image at all costs. The ego whispers that every opinion about you matters, that if someone disrespects you, you must fight back or you'll appear weak, that if someone spreads lies, you must correct them or you'll lose your worth. But here's the truth: the ego doesn't seek peace, it seeks victory. And victory in its eyes often means endless battles with shadows that don't even exist. The Buddha once gave an image to explain this. When someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, the gift still belongs to them. In the same way, when someone hurls insults at you, they are simply offering you a gift of anger. But if you refuse to accept it, it remains with them, not you. The ego, however, hates this wisdom. It insists, take the gift, open it, show everyone how wrong they are. And once you do, the poison enters your heart. Think about how many times in life you felt the urge to prove yourself. Someone underestimated you, and suddenly your entire mind was consumed with showing them who you really are. Someone mocked your work, and instead of moving forward, you became obsessed with proving them wrong. The ego feeds on these moments. It thrives on comparison, defense, and proving. But notice, when you're busy proving yourself, you're not living yourself. You're living for their approval, their recognition, their acceptance. It's a dangerous game because the ego can never be fully satisfied. Even when you win one battle, it looks for another. Even when you silence one critic, it imagines more waiting in the shadows. The ego convinces you that peace comes from the outside. When everyone praises you, when no one doubts you, when the world finally sees your worth, But peace will never come from there. Because no matter how perfect you are, someone will always misunderstand. Someone will always criticize. Someone will always resist. This is why Buddhist teachings guide us to see the ego for what it really is. A restless, hungry phantom that never stops demanding more. The more you feed it, the louder it gets. But the moment you stop feeding it, the moment you no longer chase every opportunity to defend yourself, the ego begins to lose its grip. And here lies the paradox. True strength is not in defending the ego, it is in letting go of it. When you no longer need to prove yourself, you become untouchable. Insults fall like raindrops that never soak your skin. Criticism becomes background noise, fading into silence. You realize that your value was never dependent on their words in the first place. Imagine standing in front of a mirror. The ego sees a fragile image, one crack, one insult, and the whole reflection shatters. But wisdom sees beyond the mirror. It knows that what you are cannot be broken by words, cannot be diminished by opinions, cannot be defined by anyone but yourself. And so, the question is not whether the world will attack you. It will. The question is, will you spend your life defending an ego that can never be satisfied, or will you step into a freedom where no defense is necessary? Because once you stop letting the ego drag you into every battle, you'll discover something astonishing. Silence itself can be the greatest defense. There is a kind of power that doesn't shout, doesn't fight, doesn't even move, yet it transforms everything around it. That is the wisdom of non-reaction. Most people confuse silence with weakness. They believe that if you don't react, you've lost. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes silence is strength. And sometimes silence is the very thing that exposes the emptiness of the noise around you. Think of a pond on a calm morning. The water is still, perfectly reflecting the sky. Now imagine someone throws a stone into it. Instantly, the water ripples, the reflection is broken, the clarity disturbed. This is what happens when we react without wisdom. Every stone life throws at us shatters our peace, and we never get to see the sky within us. But if we learn to remain still, even as stones are thrown, the ripples fade and the reflection returns. That is the practice of non-reaction, returning to clarity. The Buddha taught, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal law. And what is love if not the refusal to mirror another person's anger? Non-reaction is not cold indifference, it is compassion in action. It is choosing not to add more fire to a world already burning. But make no mistake, non-reaction is not easy. It takes more courage to stay still than to strike back. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can scream. But it takes a rare kind of strength to breathe deeply, to observe, to let the storm pass without being carried away. In that moment of restraint, you are not being passive, you are actively protecting your peace. And here's the beauty. When you stop reacting, you create space. Space for understanding, space for wisdom, space for the other person to reveal themselves. Sometimes, when you don't fight back, the aggressor ends up fighting only their own anger. Your silence becomes a mirror, reflecting their true nature back at them. Think about the last time someone tried to provoke you. If you had met their anger with more anger, the fire would have doubled. But if you had remained calm, how different might the story have been? Non-reaction doesn't just protect you, it transforms the entire situation. Zen masters often teach through paradox. One said, when you don't react, you act. At first, it sounds confusing, but here's what it means. By not reacting, you are making the most powerful choice possible. You are saying, I will not be controlled by your words. I will not let your storm dictate my weather. That is not passivity, it is mastery. Over time, this wisdom becomes your shield. Insults lose their sting. Criticism loses its weight. Provocations lose their power. Because you realize you don't have to attend every battle you're invited to. You don't have to light every match handed to you. You don't have to drink every poison offered to you. Non-reaction is the art of protecting your temple from being defiled. It is the discipline of choosing peace over pride, clarity over chaos, wisdom over ego. And once you taste it, you understand why masters throughout history smiled in the face of anger. They had learned that no one can steal your peace unless you hand it over. So when the world throws stones, remember the still pond. Let the ripples fade. Let the reflection return. And you'll see in the quiet of your own heart that true power is not in striking back. True power is in not needing to. Silence is often misunderstood. People think of silence as emptiness, as absence, as nothingness. But in truth, silence is not the absence of power. It is the very birthplace of it. Think about a mountain. It doesn't speak, it doesn't move, it doesn't argue with the wind. And yet its presence commands respect. That is the power of silence. It doesn't need to announce itself because its strength is undeniable. In the same way, when you embody silence, you radiate a strength that cannot be shaken. We've been conditioned to believe that strength looks like noise, loud voices, bold arguments, constant action. But the greatest strength is often invisible, quiet, unseen. A tree doesn't boast about how deep its roots are. The ocean doesn't explain how vast it is. True strength simply is. And silence is the language through which it expresses itself. When you choose silence in the face of provocation, you are not hiding, you are holding. You are holding your energy, your dignity, your clarity. You are refusing to let someone else dictate the rhythm of your heart. This requires a kind of inner discipline far greater than any outward fight. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." But sometimes even one word is unnecessary. Sometimes peace requires no words at all. Silence itself becomes the answer, the teaching, the statement. Have you ever been in the presence of someone who radiates calm without saying a thing? Maybe a wise elder, a teacher, or even just a friend who knows how to listen deeply. Their silence doesn't feel empty, it feels full. Full of patience, full of understanding, full of strength. That's because true silence is not a void, it is a presence. In our noisy world, silence becomes a rare and precious force. It unsettles people who are addicted to reaction because they cannot control it. They expect anger, defense, noise, but when met with silence, they're left facing themselves. And that in itself is transformative. But silence is not only about others, it's about you. In silence, you meet yourself. When the outer noise fades, the inner voice becomes clear. You begin to hear the whispers of your own wisdom, the guidance of your own spirit. That is why so many spiritual traditions place silence at the heart of practice. Because in silence, you no longer chase strength, you discover it was within you all along. And once you've experienced silence as strength, you stop fearing it. You stop rushing to fill every quiet moment with words or distractions. You start to savor it, to guard it, to see it as your most loyal companion. So the next time the world pushes you to react, remember this. Your silence is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is not avoidance. Your silence is your shield, your sword, your sanctuary. It is the place where your true strength gathers before it flows into every part of your life. Silence, when embraced, doesn't make you invisible. It makes you unshakable. Silence is strength, yes, but wisdom is knowing when silence serves you and when words must be spoken. The art of life is not about never speaking, nor about speaking endlessly. It is about harmony, about recognizing the moments when your voice brings healing and the moments when your silence preserves peace. Think of it like music. A song is not only made of notes, but also of pauses. Without pauses, without silence, the beauty of the music would vanish into noise. In the same way, your life becomes music when you learn how to balance words and silence. There are times when silence is the highest response. When anger is boiling in the air, when accusations fly without reason, when the other person is not ready to listen. Your words would only be fuel for the fire. In such moments, silence becomes protection. It shields your energy and prevents you from being dragged into battles where no one truly wins. But there are also times when silence is dangerous. When injustice unfolds before your eyes, when someone is being harmed, when truth needs a voice, silence can become complicity. In these moments, your voice is not just an option, it is a responsibility. Speaking then is an act of courage, of compassion, of alignment with your deeper values. So how do you know the difference? How do you know when to speak and when to stay silent? The answer lies in intention. Before you react, pause and ask yourself, am I speaking from ego or from wisdom? Am I silent out of fear or out of strength? If the words you're about to say come from a place of defense, pride, or the need to prove yourself, silence may be the wiser choice. But if your silence is born from fear of discomfort or from avoiding truth, then words may be necessary. The Buddha taught the principle of right speech, to speak only what is true, necessary, and kind. Imagine how different the world would be if every word passed through those three gates. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? If it fails even one test, silence often speaks louder. Sometimes the most powerful way to honor silence is to speak fewer words, but words that cut through illusion like a sword of clarity. One phrase spoken with wisdom can dissolve confusion more effectively than hours of debate. And sometimes the deepest love is shown not through speeches, but through simply being present, listening, and saying nothing at all. Life constantly invites you to choose noise or clarity, ego or wisdom, reaction or restraint. Every moment is a chance to practice. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes to sense when your voice will bring light and when your silence will keep the peace. So remember this, silence is powerful, but so is truth. The art lies in discerning which one the moment calls for. Speak when your words can uplift, protect, or reveal truth. Stay silent when your words would only wound, inflame, or defend the fragile ego. Peace doesn't just happen by accident. It is something we choose moment by moment with the way we respond to life. Knowing when to speak and when to stay silent is wisdom, but applying that wisdom in daily life requires strategy. Conflict will always appear, but you don't have to be consumed by it. You can learn how to walk through the fire without being burned. The first strategy is pause before reacting. It sounds simple, but it is life-changing. Most conflict doesn't come from what happens, but from our immediate reaction to it. Someone insults us and we fire back instantly. Someone cuts us off in traffic and anger explodes before we even think. But when you pause, even for 3 breaths, you create a space between the trigger and your response. And in that space, you regain control. You realize, I don't have to go where this moment wants to drag me. The second strategy is choose your battles. Not every fight deserves your energy. Some arguments are traps designed only to drain you. Ask yourself, will this matter tomorrow? Will it matter in a year? If the answer is no, let it go. Walking away is not weakness, it is wisdom. You are conserving your strength for things that truly matter. The third strategy is master the art of listening. Many conflicts arise not from deep differences, but from people feeling unheard. Sometimes, simply listening without interrupting, without defending, without planning your comeback can dissolve an argument before it even begins. When you truly listen, you send the message, I see you, I hear you, your voice matters. And that acknowledgement often softens even the hardest hearts. The fourth strategy is respond, don't react. There's a difference. Reaction is impulsive, emotional, often explosive. Response is deliberate, thoughtful, and rooted in wisdom. Instead of matching anger with anger, you can choose calm words, or no words at all. Instead of escalating, you can de-escalate. Instead of feeding the fire, you can extinguish it. The fifth strategy is know when to walk away. Some people thrive on conflict. They feed off your reaction like parasites. The more you fight, the more energy they gain. The most powerful thing you can do is to step out of their game entirely. You don't owe your presence to every battle. Protecting your peace sometimes means leaving the battlefield before it even begins. And finally, the sixth strategy. Practice inner grounding every day. Meditation, mindfulness, prayer, whatever keeps your heart centered. Because when your mind is calm, the storms outside can't shake you. Conflict loses its grip on you when you no longer carry conflict inside yourself. Imagine how your life would feel if you mastered these strategies. How much energy you would save. How much clarity you would gain. How many moments of peace you would protect. Conflict doesn't disappear, but it no longer owns you. You see it for what it is, temporary, passing, powerless against a mind that has chosen peace. And that is the heart of it. Avoiding conflict is not about avoiding life. It is about navigating life with wisdom, so that you no longer drown in every wave, but learn how to sail across them with grace. Avoiding conflict on the outside is powerful, but the greatest victory is won on the inside. Because no matter how much you protect yourself from external battles, the real battlefield is always within your own mind. If your thoughts are restless, if your emotions are easily provoked, then the world will control you. But when your mind is steady, untouched by praise or blame, gain or loss, joy or sorrow, you become unshakable. The Buddha often spoke of this state as being like a lotus flower. The lotus grows in muddy water, yet it rises above the surface, untouched by the dirt below. That is the training of the mind, to live in this messy, unpredictable world yet not be stained by it. How do we train the mind to reach this state? The first step is awareness. You cannot control what you do not notice. Begin to observe your mind as if you were watching the sky. Thoughts come and go like clouds, but you are not the clouds, you are the sky itself. When anger arises, watch it. When fear appears, watch it. Don't chase it, don't fight it, just witness it. Awareness creates distance, and in that distance you realize, I am not my thoughts, I am not my emotions, I am the observer. The second step is discipline. A mind without discipline will be tossed around by every wave of life. That is why meditation is not just a practice, but a training ground. Each time you sit, breathe, and return to the present, you are strengthening your mental muscles. You are teaching your mind not to chase distractions, not to drown in emotions, not to react to every trigger. Slowly, your mind becomes still like a lake undisturbed by wind. The third step is detachment. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. It means whether people praise you or criticize you, you don't lose yourself. Whether life gives you success or failure, you don't collapse. Detachment is the shield that keeps you from being pierced by the ups and downs of existence. The fourth step is compassion. This may seem surprising, but compassion is one of the strongest ways to remain untouched. Because when you replace judgment with understanding, anger with empathy, suddenly other people's words lose their poison. You no longer take their negativity personally. You see their suffering behind their actions, and that perspective frees you. And finally, the fifth step is consistency. Training the mind is not a one-time effort. It's a daily practice, like watering a plant. Slowly, the roots of peace grow deep and storms can no longer uproot you. Imagine this. Someone insults you, yet you feel no need to defend yourself. Someone tries to provoke you, but you remain calm. Life throws challenges, but your mind stands steady. This is not weakness, it is mastery. This is what it means to stay untouched. And once you taste that freedom, you'll realize the truth. The world doesn't need to change for you to be at peace. You simply need to train your mind. All our lives, we've been taught to chase freedom in the outside world. Freedom through money, freedom through status, freedom through relationships, possessions, or power. But if you look closely, you'll see a paradox. The more you chase external freedom, the more chains you place around yourself. You become a prisoner of what you own, a captive of what people think, a slave to circumstances you cannot control. True freedom has never been out there. True freedom begins the moment you realize it already exists within you. Think about this. Someone can lock your body in a cell, yet they cannot imprison your mind if you choose not to let them. History is filled with examples, philosophers, monks, great leaders, who endured hardship, captivity, even torture, yet remained free in spirit. How? Because they discovered the secret. Freedom is not about removing limitations outside, but about removing chains inside. The chains of fear, the chains of desire, the chains of needing approval, of clinging to control, of believing happiness depends on things staying exactly the way you want them to. When those chains are broken, you walk through the world differently. Praise no longer intoxicates you, and criticism no longer crushes you. Success doesn't inflate you, and failure doesn't define you. You begin to realize, Nothing outside of me has the power to control me, unless I give it permission. That is freedom. The Buddha described this freedom as liberation, not the freedom to always get what you want, but the freedom from needing things to be any particular way. Imagine living like that. Imagine waking up with a mind at peace, not because life is perfect, but because you no longer demand perfection from life. When you find freedom within, the outside world loses its power to enslave you. You stop being dragged by endless wants and fears. You stop measuring your worth by what you own or what others think. Instead, you move through life lightly, unattached, yet fully alive. This doesn't mean you reject the world. It means you engage with it differently. You enjoy what comes, but you don't cling when it goes. You love deeply, but without fear of loss. You live fully, but without being owned by the ups and downs. And here is the beautiful irony. When you no longer cling to external freedom, the world itself begins to feel lighter. Work becomes less of a burden. Relationships become less of a battlefield. Even hardship becomes a teacher instead of a punishment. Because nothing can truly imprison a mind that has chosen to be free. True freedom is not about changing your circumstances. It's about changing your relationship to them. And once you touch that inner freedom, you carry it with you everywhere. No one can give it to you, and no one can take it away. That is the highest power. That is liberation. At the heart of everything we've explored, there is a simple truth. You cannot always control the world, but you can always choose how you respond to it. Life will bring drama, people will test you, challenges will appear again and again. But every single time you hold the power to choose. Do you step into the chaos, or do you remain anchored in peace? Drama is loud, it demands your attention, it feeds on your energy. Peace, on the other hand, is quiet. It waits patiently for you to notice it. It doesn't shout, it doesn't fight. It simply offers you refuge every single moment. When you choose peace over drama, you are not avoiding life, you are mastering it. You are saying, my energy is precious, my mind is sacred, my spirit is not for sale. You become like the mountain, unmoved by the storm. You walk through life lighter, calmer, freer. And here is the beauty. When you choose peace, you don't just transform yourself, you transform everyone around you. Your calm presence becomes medicine. Your silence becomes strength. Your wisdom becomes light in a world drowning in noise. So as this journey closes, carry this truth with you. The power to ignore, the power to let go, the power to choose silence over reaction. It all leads to one destination, peace. And peace is the highest form of freedom you will ever know. If these words touch something within you, let them stay with you. And if you wish to walk further on this path of clarity and wisdom, I invite you to join our community here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe so that each week you can return to this space of calm and reflection. Share this teaching with someone who may need it today. And most importantly, live it, breathe it, and let peace guide you in every step. Because in the end, the choice is always yours. Choose peace over drama. Choose freedom over chains. Choose wisdom over noise. And your life will never be the same.